My sister, April, who is my almost twin, she's 11 months younger than I am. April stopped believing in God when she was 7 years old. Now, to be fair, I think she probably only had a vague notion of God at the age of 7, developed in Sunday services at our Pentecostal churches, in the Bible stories we read and the songs that we sang. And if someone had asked her at 7, what do you think about God? She probably would have answered something like this. God is a man with a white beard who lives in the sky with his son Jesus, and Jesus loves us and all the little children of the world. And that is not a bad theology, everyone. That God is love. But honestly, there had been no reason in my sister's first 7 years of life to question or doubt that the stories she had heard about God and Jesus were anything other than absolute truth. But then, in the fall of 1982, the Superman movie, the original iconic one with Christopher Reeve and Gene Hackman, how many of you have seen it? Almost everybody. I'm sure it's streaming somewhere if you want to catch it. But that movie aired on network TV, and we got to watch it for the first time. And April told me that she loved that movie so much and was so enamored with the images of Superman that she became convinced Superman was real, just like Jesus. And she says she clearly remembers stepping outside onto our front porch in eastern Kentucky, looking up at the stars and saying, any second now, either Jesus or Superman are going to come out of the sky. And for weeks, months, she kept up this expectant vigil. She would look up at the sky, not wanting to miss that moment when one or the other, Jesus or Superman, came soaring down. She said she would pause during games of tag at recess to look up. Waiting for the bus stop, she'd check out of conversations to look up. She did this every day until the spring, looking up. What if Jesus or Superman are coming today? But one morning, when the daffodils were blooming, the air was getting warmer, when she stepped outside, got to the bus stop and looked up, a new thought came to her. What if Jesus and Superman aren't coming? What if Jesus and Superman are just stories? And that moment of questioning and of doubt opened up all new possibilities for her. And over the next few days, she began to ask, well, if Jesus and Superman are just stories, what if everything in the Bible is just a story? And if everything in the Bible is just a story, what if God is just a story? And if God is just a story, what if everything grown-ups tell me is just a story too? That what if changed her entire little being. And she knows that by the time she turned 8 and started 3rd grade, that what she had become convinced of was that indeed everything's grown-ups told her was a story. And she felt equally certain that she could not voice those kinds of questions and doubts because in our family and in the culture in which we lived, doubt was not acceptable, and some things simply could not be spoken aloud. And so my little 8-year-old sister bravely tucked her newfound disbelief close to her heart, and she says she went through the motions of religion until she was old enough not to have to anymore. And it took her decades to tell anybody that story, but that deep knowledge shaped how she interacted with the world because she began to learn that if everything was just a story, then that meant she did not have to believe the stories people were telling her about who she was and who she had to be. She began to realize she could tell her own story. She could make different choices from the ones she saw all around us. She could decide for herself who she was going to be, who she was going to love. She told me years later that my sincere religious belief that I had as an adolescent, and I did, y'all, I was a firm believer. I went to church more the year I was 14 than our pastor did. I carried my Bible every day of 8th and 9th grade to my public schools. It gave me comfort and a sense of grounding. But my sister said, wasn't I frustrated by how little we were allowed to ask, how little we were allowed to be ourselves? And the fact is, as much as I was a true believer as a child, I was frustrated by the restrictions of the religion of my childhood, because as I experienced it, it left no room for curiosity and metaphors, two of my favorite things since before I learned to read. And while my sister had a flashing moment of clarity precociously at the age of 8, my doubts and what-ifs unfolded slowly in me, a gradual process of questioning and finding answers that did not fit at all what I was discovering about myself and the world. And however our what-ifs came to us, they led my sister and me to leave behind belief systems that tried to stunt our curiosity, while demanding that we shrink ourselves, fragment ourselves, that said we could not show up as whole people. When we stopped waiting for Jesus and Superman, it felt like new possibilities, new stories unfolded for us. Letting go of one right answer was liberating for me, as I'm sure it maybe was for some of you in this room. And I became a Unitarian Universalist after years of being unchurched, because while I did not want a single right answer, I did long for spiritual community that was going to nurture that search for meaning that I think is at the heart of everything each of us does. But I know some people, and I'm sure many of you do too, for whom what-ifs and questions and doubts are just scary and empty, and they are an unending search for truth when what people want is a sure answer amidst life's chaos. And it can be hard to welcome possibilities if what you are seeking is certainty. And I think it is oh so human when we are faced with difficult times, with turbulent politics, painful personal tragedies, or a pandemic that turns all of our normals upside down. It is oh so human to seek some comfort, to look for assurance that we are going to be okay, for some sign that there is indeed a plan, and maybe that there is a God who is looking out for us personally and any moment will come down and take care of us. There is comfort in that belief system that maybe there's a Jesus or a Superman who will save us, who will give us the right answer to all of our questions and help us build solid ground. There's comfort in that, and I have deep compassion. And in the past few years, that compassion has grown even deeper for anybody seeking that sense of safety. I don't agree with it, but I have compassion for it. But the truth for me is that Jesus and Superman are just stories, and they are not coming to save us. People, we must save ourselves. We must save each other. And we must do that because the world is actually always shifting under our feet. And I think one of the reasons we as humans want something solid and certain so badly is because that somewhere deep in our bodies, we are very much aware that we are on a rock that is spinning on its axis, revolving around the sun in the vast emptiness of space. And underneath our feet, there is no solid ground. It is just shifting plates on molten magma. And we are specks of stardust, are we not? And our time is so short and brief. And we struggle. We struggle to make sense of it. We struggle to make space for change because it is constantly coming at us. And we as people are always having to figure out how to survive, let alone thrive in the chaos of this world. And so people across the ages, all over this planet, have told stories that there is a God in charge. And all we have to do is wait. But it is just one story. British novelist Jeanette Winterson once wrote that stories are what we tell ourselves to make ourselves come true. And that one story we have so often told as people is that there is a God with all the answers. And only some of us, and isn't it ironic that it is almost always the people in power, have a direct line to that God. That those people are the ones who will be safe, that God will take care of them, and that if somebody else isn't being taken care of, that's God's will and not our problem. It is a life-limiting theology that sets some people up as people who matter and some who don't. And it is a life-limiting theology that says oppressions are God's will. And we have only to look at the history of this country to see how that turns out when our belief systems end up guiding actions that lead to hurting others. The genocide of native peoples on this land, the enslavement of Africans on this soil, the second-class status of women and any gender nonconforming people, those oppressions all grow out of a belief system that God loves some of us but not others. They grow out of a belief system that says just wait for God, wait for your Jesus or Superman, and you will be saved. We have made that story all too often come true. But lest you think I'm picking only on the theists, and only on religious people, let me be clear that the clinging to the illusion of solid ground can take a whole lot of forms, and I, as a white, middle-class, progressive, cis woman, have too often found myself clinging tightly with both hands to the surety of my own righteous positions. And in those moments when I have found myself reflexively resisting ideas and different possibilities, I can recognize that I am, in my own way, waiting for Jesus and Superman. That in doing that, I have closed myself off to the what-ifs that maybe keep me open to other possibilities. And I have indeed been a progressive feminist for over 30 years, and I've officially been a UU for a decade. And I love this faith movement enough that I'm committed to ministry in it. But you all, too often in UU spaces, I have seen this tendency of white, especially middle class UUs, to think that we are always right, that we have the answer, even though we would reject anyone who shows up and says, I have the answer for you. And we may not espouse a dogmatic theology, and we may scoff at people who are waiting for Jesus, but we white, progressive, liberal UUs, while we are not waiting for Jesus and Superman, I have found in my life that we so often are showing up as if we are Jesus and Superman. And what we need to do is show up with a little humility, a lot more curiosity, and a whole lot of questions for our own selves. Because what if we did truly accept that we don't have all the answers? What if we accept that there are different ways of doing things and that somebody else is imagining possibilities that haven't even occurred to us yet? What if some people are already making those unimaginable to us possibilities real? What would it mean as a people of faith if we showed up not as the saviors of the world, but as collaborators and co-conspirators in dismantling those oppressions? What if we recognize and witness that the interpersonal and systemic violence that is rampant in our culture, that kills far too many people of color and far too many poor people, also damages the souls of all of us? And it is spiritual work, my people, to show up and try to change it, not as the experts, but with others. Aboriginal activists in the 1970s expressed this better than I can when they said, if you are showing up to save me, you are wasting your time. But if you are showing up because you know that your salvation is tied together in mine, then let us work together. And what if our Unitarian Universalist faith is calling us to do just that? What if it is calling all of us to show up as our full, messy, uncertain, doubting, questioning human selves? What if our faith is calling us to show up and make mistakes and apologize and do better? What if it is calling us in love to be accountable to each other, to our congregations, to our broader faith movement, and to the communities in which we live? What certainties would we let go of? What power would we release? What new stories might we tell instead about who we are and how we can remake the world? Can we, as a people of faith, show up and be as brave as a 7-year-old whose whole world gets upended but turns to wonder and curiosity and love to tell new stories and to connect with new people in ways she could never have imagined before? My prayer for us is that we will be so brave and that we will be so loving. May it be so.